Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the BUL International Law Group event on international energy law, an issue that is very pertinent in our times, especially after the Ukraine war and on the rise of the expense costs. And that's why we're here in order to discuss the wider implications of energy law when it comes to international coalition, when it comes to the law of the sea, when it comes to the geopolitical also aspects, and maybe the environmental also aspects, with a distinguished set of panelists. The chair is going to be Dr. Jurgita Malinauskaite from Brunel University London School of Law. And immediately, with no further delays, the baton is going to pass to her in order to introduce to you the speakers and to wage the discussion. I have to tell you in advance that, in essence, any questions from your part, from the part of the audience, can actually be set in the end of this discussion through the Q&A section button that you can see in the bottom of this Zoom chat room. With no further delay, as I said, Professor Jurgita Malinauskaite from Brunel University London, the microphone is yours, and we thank all the panelists for their participation.
Okay, thank you, Solon. I would like to thank the organizers, Dr. Solomon and Dr. Patricia Hobbs, for organizing this fantastic event. And you know, energy nowadays is truly everywhere in the news, and it is regarded as the lifeblood of modern societies. And as Solon already mentioned, obviously, war in Ukraine has produced unprecedented increases in energy prices. But today's topic, we will go beyond that. We also will discuss some trade-related issues, probably mentioning charter as well. We also have COP going on, COP27 in Egypt, and I believe today it's actually remarkably is the EU Energy Law Day in there as well. So there are all different contexts that we can discuss today's topic, and we have a remarkable panel today consisting of 3 speakers. Just to bear that we are still expecting 1 speaker. He will join us about 10 minutes late. So I will start right now with Professor Maria Gavouneli. Very warm welcome. Professor is Professor of International Law, is from Faculty of Law, and she's also from Athens Public International Law Center. She's Director of Refugee and Migration Studies Hub. She has been a Fulbright Scholar from the University of California, Berkeley, Associate Research Fellow, University of London, visiting professor at many universities and research institutions, published extensively on the law of the sea, energy and environmental law, as well as migration issues, and she also the author of 5 monographs. So welcome, Professor Gavouneli. The floor is yours.
It's a pleasure to be among you. Thank you very much for the
15
invitation.
minutes for presentation. Thank
Perhaps even less, so that we can have time to exchange views, actually, more than anything else. Now, energy is indeed a very pertinent subject these days. As winter comes in, everybody would actually have a look at the bill and make sure that the gas is not running non-stop, simply because the gas is not running non-stop in Europe anymore, which by itself is an amazing development, is it not? I mean, last year we wouldn't even think about thoughts along those lines, and suddenly within months we have a different universe. Let me just point on different directions, and perhaps we can try and put all those things together by the end of our discussion today. The first point, and I think that is the most pertinent point of all, a year ago, we were at a situation where the European Union was talking about decarbonization. we were talking about the possibility of becoming neutral by 2050, energy neutral. We were talking about aggressive policies, moving away from fossil fuels and towards green energy in all its shapes and forms. In my country, in Greece, we were talking about a very aggressive program of delignitization, where lignite is our local coal. And the government had announced that by 2027, all the lignite installations in the country would have actually been stopped, and therefore energy would have moved entirely onto renewable sources or other sources. Here we were looking for a bright new future, if you like, a very green future. And then February came, Ukraine came, and the situation today is entirely different. How different? Well, first and foremost, fossil fuel is not out. Not only that, but fossil fuel has now been reclaiming their share of the energy generation market. In my country, again, I would be using our example because I think we are very much in the thick of things, and we are bellwether for what happens in the world today. Just yesterday, just this past 2 days ago, we started exploration and exploitation in blocks off Crete, on the southern side of Crete, for fossil fuels. Unthinkable. For 10 years, we haven't done anything like that, and people were moving away from fossil fuels, and now here we are. Why? It's not as if we're going to end up with oil and gas tomorrow morning. One way or another, this kind of exploration and exploitation requires at least 10 years before you end up with something that is tangible and therefore marketable. Still, it has become necessary in order to survive. Second point, LNG. LNG, liquefied natural gas, fossil fuel, but in another shape or form, if you like. We did not have enough LNG in Europe. The US had LNG. We had hoped that there would be no reason to talk about this thing. And suddenly, the whole of Europe is actually buying LNG like crazy, moving it in specially built ships. Greek ship owners are having a killing. And there you are. Why? Again, because we have need of transition fuels, and there's no other way. Germany is talking about reopening the nuclear plants, the ones that were supposed to close down by the end of this year. And of course, renewable energy is taking a bit. And the question is the following, and I think that is the question that any reasonable person would actually have in mind. Why, oh why, if we are in such trouble, why do we invest to these long-winded projects on fossil fuel rather than invest in renewable energy that at the end of the day is certainly cheaper? I mean, solar energy, wind energy, it's not, the sun has not sent us the bill as yet. Eventually they will, but there you are. But what is wrong? Why don't we have investments that would actually help our economies as well, our economies that are not in the best shape possible, and rather stick with the old things? There are many answers to that question. I would perhaps concentrate on the most basic one. And that basic one is the grid, infrastructure. What we are lacking, and we are lacking that in the whole of Europe and the Western world in general, is any upgrade to our existing grid. What happens nowadays is that Germany, for instance, is entirely capable of producing the entire need, the whole of their needs in energy from renewable sources. However, days when they have long winds and plenty of sunshine over the country, they need to switch off the system. Why? Because the grid is going to fry. The cables are so old that they simply cannot cope with the amount of energy thus produced. And obviously, the fact that we are lacking in technology as yet, and I insist on that, as yet, we don't have the necessary means to just store energy, that would create a major problem for all of us. In other words, it's easier to fall back on what we have. So you can store LNG in yet another ship. You can actually find a place, even an empty underwater sink, and just fill it up with LNG. Somehow you would find storage in these circumstances. And then you move on merrily the way you always used to do. But with renewable sources and no infrastructure worth its name, you would simply blow up your whole system rather than doing anything that is really noticeable and useful. So the immediate reaction we have is actually to reverse the course for pipelines. So for instance, in Europe, in Eastern Europe in particular, natural gas would usually come from the east through Russia and Ukraine, and it would go to Bulgaria, and from that point onwards, perhaps move on towards Italy. Nowadays, the gas comes in LNG form through Greece, and we have reversed the pipeline so that actually that would flow into Bulgaria and Hungary and parts Western in a manner that it was unthinkable in the past. That's the first point. The second point, and I would stop immediately so that we can pick up that from that point onwards. The immediate need that we have for traditional sources of energy, oil and gas, fossil fuels, LNG, all kinds of things, really makes us fall back onto traditional markets. And that also means traditional problems. Where are you going to get oil and gas in the Eastern Mediterranean, where you actually need it? Well, you have to go out in the sea and look for it. How are you going to drill for oil and gas in particular areas that are not necessarily chartered in any shape or form? What happens if there is no boundaries, there's no delimitation in place? All the old problems crop up. And these old problems can become even more complicated simply because there's no reference point and there's no goodwill. Or they could actually use the present crisis as an occasion, a chance to just move forward. The best example possible is actually the new agreement between Lebanon and Israel that has resolved the problem that everybody thought was simply unsolvable. It became solvable because of the crisis, under, of course, the specific conditions of the area. A minor issue under the same thing. This fallback on all positions may actually also operate as an incentive for schemes that have been deemed dead or unmarketable so that they can actually be revived. For instance, there has been discussions about a pipeline or a cable, an electric cable, in the Eastern Mediterranean that would go from Egypt, for instance, towards Europe. It was deemed very expensive, totally complicated. Imagine the jurisdictional issues as you go through the bottom of the sea. It's a very complicated process. I mean, international lawyers would absolutely love the conundrum, but still it's a very complicated process. Extremely expensive. The Eastern Mediterranean is a very deep sea. So it's not as if you just have a bottom line that would actually go straight forward and you lay on your cables and that's all there is to it. It has all kinds of valleys and rifts and very deep kind of areas where you really need to go down and back up again. So the 2 kilometers of your cable become 5 kilometers. so we're talking about things to the tune of millions and billions into the sea. Suddenly things that were not marketable are now possible. Whether that is going to be a long-term marketability that we're talking about, whether they are truly sustainable, that is a question mark for the time being. But I suspect that if the situation goes on for quite some time, and it will go on for quite some time, as long as we don't have the infrastructure we need, then we would certainly need to revisit all these assumptions, ideas, and suggestions we have in the past. I'll stop here, and I would be very happy to come back to some of those questions again.
Thank you, Professor Gavouneli. Do we have any questions? Because we have a few minutes for questions. Solon, what is the process?
Yes, Professor Malinauskaite, do you want to have any comment? You can voice your comment, and all of us, of course, also Professor Heffron and Dr. Hobbs, and of course the audience can put again in the Q&A section. We look forward to your thoughts, as Professor Malinauskaite said. Maybe it's too early, maybe for the audience again to warm up a bit, so we can engage with some ideas, and then the audience can follow also. So, Professor Malinauskaite, your comment, and Professor Heffron.
Yeah, thank you. I believe you raised very important 3 points, and especially your last point in terms of like not having infrastructure. It is one of the key obstacles in terms of having proper renewable energy and going 100% on renewable energy. And obviously we have lots of issues. COVID, one aspect, when war in Ukraine, that it seems that it is just that transition is slowing, and there are extra barriers, and you mentioned jurisdictional political issues that we have crossing borders, but also technological as well, because energy storage is another big thing. I don't know if you would like to elaborate on this, but I have some other questions as well. I just wonder if
I just want to say one word for that, perhaps, before we move on to the next. The question of infrastructure, it's a question of investment. So long term, we would actually be talking about millions and billions thrown into the system. The problem we have, and the idea of decarbonization was exactly that somehow all this investment is going to take place. The problem we have right now is that we are operating under conditions that are financially restrained, so we cannot afford that kind of investment at this point. And why we cannot afford it? Because we're getting out of the pandemic with no money being generated along the way. Governments had to throw money out of the window, literally, because people had to survive. And at the same time, the energy prices have gone so high that really nobody can afford to spend additional money preparing for the future. Everybody's very concerned about the present. And that I think is the perfect conundrum. And the reason why we are so very worried at this point. But you also had another question. I would be happy to hear that.
Yeah, thank you. Just moving what would be in terms of your reaction to a recent public announcement in terms of the Energy Charter Treaty, that we have like some potential withdrawals that Spain recently made about their plans, but also earlier made by Polish, Dutch, and French officials as well. I just would like to hear your views on that.
Thank you. Yes, the Energy Charter Treaty is a very interesting example. For those of us in the audience who are not entirely conversant with it, the Energy Charter Treaty was actually the very first international instrument agreed after the fall of the wall, literally months. Why? Because energy was important. And therefore, we had to find a way for the Western economies to converse with the economies in transition, the socialist economies that were moving into another era, and the flow of energy had to be in place and safeguarded. So the Energy Charter Treaty ended up being two things in one. It became a mini WTO at a time when the WTO was not actually ready to accept the new members, and at the same time it became a mini investment treaty, allowing for the settlement of disputes arising out of energy investments. At the time, I think it was revolutionary. It has certainly helped enormously in setting up the world as we know it today. What happens is that the ECT is actually geared towards protecting energy investments, and of course, which are the old investments, but oil and gas investments, isn't it? So it's clearly not the kind of thing that would help you getting into the new green kind of economy. Why? Because simply there's not enough investment to be protected under these provisions. So there's the idea, therefore, and it all started with this kind of question, the idea that governments such as the Italian government or the Dutch government would have to compensate for projects that did not run because the government chose to move away from fuel and gas, from fossil fuel towards green energy. That in itself is really hugely problematic. And imagine, of course, that the government here has an obligation to protect the investment under the ECT, and there's another obligation under the Paris Agreement to take care of climate change, for instance, and energy is an integral part, especially green energy is an integral part of climate change. So you can imagine the unbelievable mess this all creates. Now, the question here is the following. The ECT has a grandfather clause, a sunset clause, that says that whatever has happened, whatever has started as a dispute before a state moves away from the treaty would actually still be regulated by the treaty for the next 20 years. So, what do you do? Even if you move away, in essence, you keep having the ECT with you for the next 20 years. The European Commission is actually engaged right now in an attempt to modernize the treaty. And their argument is that stick around, let's modernize the thing. And then you can walk away, but at this point, you walk away with the modernized ECT rather than the old provisions that we all find so repugnant these days. There's an additional argument, and I have to thank a dear friend with whom I was talking about it the other day, and that argument says that perhaps the states can actually come to an agreement whereby they would just agree the sunset clause away. Perfectly true. As with all agreements, you can amend the agreement with the consent of the parties involved. The question is, would all agree on that? Would they all be on the same page? Because it would have been ideal to just forget about the sunset clause and just move away. It could be done on a bilateral basis, perhaps. Yes. So we need to find ways out of that, but there's clearly an additional transition that is in place. The ECT was the perfect transition document, and now it becomes again a transition document towards a new era. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for your really expanded answer. I can see now we have all the speakers.
To welcome also Professor Roeben from the BUL International Law Group. On behalf of the group, welcome you here, your presence. And we're ready to hear also your statement after Professor Heffron.
Thank you. Thank you, Solon. Our next speaker is Professor Raphael Heffron. He's a professor in energy justice, the social contract and sustainability at the Universite de Pau de Pays Adour in France. Sorry, I cannot speak French. He is also a Jean Monnet professor in the just transition to a low carbon economy awarded by the European Commission for the period 2019-2022. He was appointed as a senior counsel at Janssen Law Firm in Brussels. Heffron is also qualified barrister at law. His work has a principal focus on achieving a sustainable and just transition to a low carbon economy and combines a mix of law, policy, and economics. So welcome, Professor Heffron. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. And I think a lot of key points have been made, let's say, in the first half an hour of the presentation and also short discussion. But let's say, for me, the key theme I wanted to discuss today was the rise of energy justice. And in many respects, if I refer just to some of the points already raised about, you know, in essence, the system isn't really working. Climate change has already been touched on. And when we think of the need in terms of our climate targets, we think of what's happening today in terms of the COP conference. And we have to think, where is international energy law contributing to this debate? And let's say if we go back to 2020, when the head of the UN announced that there was a climate emergency, well, considering that the energy sector contributes the majority of carbon dioxide emissions and probably the majority of methane emissions, since most of them are unrecorded from the energy sector, we could determine that energy contributes therefore the majority of greenhouse gas emissions and is the key problem in terms of the climate change challenge. As a result, we can therefore say that where is international energy law contributing? And we'd have to, let's say, if we were to grade it as we would grade many of our students, we would probably have to give it a fail. It's not really, you know, the system isn't really there to deliver on climate change. And I think that points to a second key point already brought up around the Russia-Ukraine war. And we see that an outbreak of war involving two countries has upset the whole EU energy system and even beyond. And what I would say is, you know, to me, what the crisis shows is how have we been convinced by multinational companies, by successive governments across many EU countries, that what they were doing in the energy sector was good. Clearly, there was, you know, the investment strategy advice that they were adopting and trying to deliver upon in terms of law and policy. Clearly, it wasn't good enough. And I remember doing one or two investment law and policy, you know, stroke economic policy classes as an undergraduate or postgrad. And I think the first thing they said to you at the very first session was, you know, when you are making an investment, you should always diversify your portfolio. This is something that's been amiss in the whole energy sector for far too long. And, you know, when I hear policymakers say the response to Russia-Ukraine crisis is to go back to the strategy that brought us to this point where an outbreak of war can bring everyone back nearly to this square one of going, how can we get more energy? And it's only the fossil fuel energy that we can build. Suddenly, renewable energy and other low carbon energies cannot be built. you know, as cheaply. And I do like the point from Maria earlier that, you know, the infrastructure point, and, you know, we do seem to forget that when you do build or search for fossil fuel energy infrastructure, it does take a long time. And I would go further and ask the question, who is paying for the pipelines? Who is paying for the new train lines that need to be built to, you know, let's say move coal or oil or gas even from one part of a country to another? Who is paying for, you know, adding to shipping ports to ensure that, you know, ships are there to be able to transport that oil, gas or coal? And in many ways, or in many cases, it is actually national governments, not the energy companies, who many are earning super high profits, supernormal profits. Many governments have been generally reluctant to, you know, have a windfall tax. Yet we saw once renewable energy companies earned a little extra money, they could have put that extra money into technological developments such as battery storage, but instead we saw some EU countries try and take away the money from the renewable energy companies. So when they did have a windfall, it was taken away. But suddenly, if you're an oil, gas or coal company, windfall taxes should not apply. And that's why, let's say, my major research focus is around energy justice and trying to ensure that there is a fairness across energy policies. And this applies across the different energy sources, but also, you know, across different countries, across different, let's say, populations within countries. And for me, energy justice really has to be something that is promoted when we think of developing further energy policy. And one of the key reasons it should be promoted is we should be trying to all ensure that more just outcomes are, you know, delivered in society. And I think we need to reflect again, you know, in relation to some of those points that Maria made earlier, that, you know, maybe for too long, this traditional energy system supported by a framework of international law has had a more short to medium term focus in terms of economic development. We need to move to something that has a more medium to longer term focus. And if we do that, we are more likely to achieve that sustainable and low carbon economy that is being discussed at the majority of the fora at COP 27 this year. So what I would say is, you know, I'm not going to labor the point on Energy Charter. I think it's been discussed, but I think, you know, that is one of many examples where the international law behind the current energy system needs to change. We need to have a new framework for an energy system that will deliver on our climate targets for 2030, because you can just see the reports all coming out. As Jurgita said, you know, you see those reports all coming out about COP27, highlighting the emergency situation that we are in, and we can't really afford to wait around and take steps back in policy, despite let's say the Ukraine-Russia war. And I would just point to two examples, you know, where we can deliver, and recent law and policy development shows we can deliver. And we see in the UK, offshore wind can deliver to baseload electricity supply. And I think if you follow UK energy law, you will see that they introduced significant changes, significant subsidies, and different options, like different investment frameworks for offshore wind. And in many ways, they are to rival the existing ones that already exist for oil and gas. And over 8 years, the UK was nearly able to drop the price of offshore wind. I think it's somewhere between 60 to 80%. And you may say, yes, the UK is an example of a developed world economy, but you only need to look at India and see over, I think, 8 to 10 years, they were able to do the same, around a 60 to 80% drop in the cost of solar energy. And this is despite India purchasing most of the solar energy panels off China. So they're not even developing them in their own country. But again, that policy framework was changed. And suddenly in India, you have a discussion, you know, is coal actually that cheap? Is gas that cheap? And people are thinking that, you know, maybe not. And, you know, what we need to change is we need to get more, let's say, energy technology into place. And if we're thinking about a just transition, not just in, you know, what's going to happen in the global north, but also the global south. And I would say many of the global south, we need to be targeting rural populations. And for me, I think solar and wind offer more opportunity to give electricity access and energy access to rural populations rather than this large gas or oil infrastructure. And I think, you know, that's maybe a debate for another day. But again, you know, it feeds into this view that the international energy system is favored, you know, to ensure development of oil, gas and coal across the world. And let's say for us as a research unit down here, that's our focus on energy justice, to try and achieve that fairness across the different energy sources for the different populations within countries and across different countries themselves. So, I mean, I think in a nutshell, I will leave it there and leave opportunity for the next speaker and some Q&A.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Heffron. I just looking if we have any reaction from audience first. If not, I just would like to sort of react to your concept of energy justice, and by the way, you know, I can see in Scopus you've been cited widely, and most cited scholars worldwide, Scopus 2,500 plus. Many congratulations. And I read as well a few articles that you wrote in terms of the concept of energy justice. Maybe you can define in terms of different aspects and distributional, restorative, and maybe do you sort of have some sort of hierarchy in that context? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, there's very simply, energy justice is about the application of human rights across the energy life cycle. So from extraction to production to operation to supply, consumption, waste management, stroke decommissioning. It involves 5 forms of justice. A few you mentioned there: distributive, procedural, recognition, restorative, and cosmopolitan. They are, there is no maybe set hierarchy. It's as you come across a particular energy problem, you apply it. And I would say, in terms of, you know, what you just mentioned there about citations, really, you know, what that demonstrates really for me is that, you know, this is probably one of the most exciting times to be a lawyer who's involved or who's researching on energy, because for, you know, never before have so many other disciplines wanted to get involved in justice debates. And like was said, I think it was by you or Alice earlier, you know, today, because of all the problems, everyone is able to talk about energy. If you ask anyone, they all have their opinion on the energy sector. And equally, all disciplines at a university are thinking about energy justice. And I would just say, if you look through the energy justice research, you will see that probably only around 5 to 10% of scholars talking about energy justice are actually lawyers. The other 90% to 95% are coming from all different types of disciplines. So it's a great opportunity to read what other disciplines say about justice, their views on justice, how they're trying to use different methods and theories to analyze justice. And I think there is a great gap there for energy justice energy justice scholars from a legal perspective to really get in and join the debate and point a way forward to these other scholars, you know, maybe about some of our views coming, let's say, as it were, from international law, and, you know, help them to really make those connections where we can achieve change.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Heffron. I think we have to move to our last speaker. Welcome, Professor Volker Roeben. So we're moving from Greece to France and now to the UK. Professor Roeben is Dean of Durham Law School and Professor of International Law. He's also visiting professor at the China University of Political Science and Law in Beijing. Formerly, Professor Roeben was Senior Research Fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Law and Public International Law. He held quite a few different positions, including Professor of Energy at Dundee University. Volker is the author of an editor of 7 books and 40 articles, and in 2018 he published towards the European Energy Union European Strategy in International Law with Cambridge University Press. And I just missed that we also discussed the Energy Charter. So Volker was advised at the Energy Charter Secretary. So welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. The floor is yours.
Anita, yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I think what I'll be brief because this is obviously a highly interesting panel. I think my remarks will really complement nicely what the previous speakers have said, and all of them actually, in the sense that I will want to speak a bit about the World Trade Framework for an energy transition, and that complements what Maria has said and also what Raphael just said, because I do agree with these speakers that to a certain extent international energy law, broadly speaking, is to the extent it really does exist as such, and is in need of reform to meet these new priorities about fundamentally what we call a just transition. But it is moving slowly, and there are certain crunch points where we will see reform needs, and world trade law is one of them. So as I think Raphael particularly mentioned, is that the UK and others, not just the UK, United States as well, and China, for instance, is using clearly the potential for particularly offshore wind energy. That has probably some of the largest potentials to bring about a swift and powerful energy transition. And what we observe in this, and we would say from a normative perspective, that requires the full support from the international law. But what we observe is, of course, that the main standard, the main yardstick for this arise from world trade law, and to a certain extent, that's proving an obstacle, and I'll explain why and what this may mean in the future. It seems to be, to me, one of the main focal point, really, of our discussion about reform needs of between competing priorities here. So, as a background, as many people will know this, as what we see as a worldwide move towards a investment in, or encouraging investment, primarily private investment in the exploitation of offshore, is really a matter of innovative technology. Much of this now moves towards really deep water wind, where the wind just blows much harder and more steadily, and therefore overcomes the usual problems of intermittency that we have had with onshore wind. this summer we saw it quite drastically, that there is actually a problem here. But on the open waters, the wind is steady and it blows steadily. So it may actually solve. It may actually be the most powerful renewable energy resource we have. Now that requires, to a certain extent, that does require investment, heavy investment. It requires also learning. Over time, as the industry matures, and Raphael mentioned this, that was certainly the case in other areas, the cost will come down, but not at the beginning. At the beginning, this does require public investment, I think, or public support. That's pretty clear. That's an economic case for this, but where I'm getting to now is about these competing priorities. Is that the main framework for this type, the main international legal framework for this type of support is really still the World Trade Law. We all know this has a bit of a tough patch right now, but it nevertheless is being respected in all over the world as the framework that we can agree on. So we don't want to throw this out, but we need to understand what it would mean for states wanting to support this type of innovative technology. Now, when we did in Durham, we did a bit of background research to this on this, and you will see that all the governments moving into this field now make a heavy put a heavy requirement on the support, and that's what you may briefly or bluntly call local content. As we all know around this table, local content is really something that's not so unfamiliar to international energy law, and it has mostly been used for oil and gas exploration. So if you want to, normally state companies in these in the resource-rich countries to require the use of local content in one way or another. It has interestingly never been challenged under the WTO, although you could say, what is the compatibility of such local content when you have national treatment provisions under WTO law? So don't you discriminate against content being imported from abroad? If you require that the investor uses the local content, be it labor or be it technology, mostly in the as I said, this has never it's a standard practice in oil and gas. It's never been challenged under WTO. There may be several reasons for this. One of them probably is that it is overall a small portion of the investment that's needed in these energy forms, and also probably because the companies are often state-owned. Now, local content becomes a huge issue now, in a huge element really of all these government policies subsidizing and supporting the innovative offshore development. So in the US, for instance, and under the call it the Biden Act, it has got the technical term is a different one. You have a lot of this. You have requirements that the companies that want to exploit that offshore energy have to use American-made technology. They have to use American labor. The same is true for the UK. There is a requirement that companies that bid for these so-called contracts for difference, for instance, but also for specific subsidies, must use content from the UK. And I could go on. Effectively, any government system that supports this requires the use of technology made in the country. And that's something that's probably specific to renewable energy, simply because technology plays such a big role, and countries now want to build up their technology capacity onshore in the country. Now that is in principle a huge challenge for WTO law, which does not like any kind of differentiated treatment between the state's own economy and those of other parties. And it has, interestingly enough, been challenged several times under the WTO. And I mentioned this is really interesting because, as I said, for oil and gas, that never was the case, but we have had several cases now under the WTO where that has been challenged. And I can't go into detail of this, but some of these cases are quite well known. The Canada and also the India cases have been discussed, and they have all effectively used the GATT standard, that's Article 3.4, but also the subsidies and countervailing measures regime, and finally the multilateral agreement, but also the GATT. And to cut a long story short, the rules have been interpreted quite restrictively. So in fact, you have a very hard time as a state, to be quite frank, to require the use of local content in renewable energy. Now, I must effectively, the big caveat of this is that the specific situation of offshore renewables has not been tested, but it is now being tested in two situations that are very salient. One is the dispute between the EU and the UK about the use of that requirement in the contracts for differences regime, and that's pending. It's at the negotiation stage, so it hasn't reached the dispute settlement body, but is being alleged by the EU that the rules of the UK are in violation of WTO. And the same situation arises now, the same type of dispute arises now between the EU and the USA in respect of the Biden Act. Now, so this is a very hot topic. Now, as I said, the original the analysis of the cases will point to that being not allowed. And the interesting question in terms of the broader question now is where do we anchor how can I put it, a demand for a WTO law to reform itself and to accept that that there may be good reasons why it should allow, at least for the time being, member states to require or to couple their subsidies with a local content requirement. And that goes back to the question that I think the previous speakers mentioned. The introduction of new normative parameters into the traditional rules that have governed energy, but not just energy. WTO law obviously applies to any type of good, but it has also, fallen on energy. And energy law, to a certain extent, has suffered from the lack of specific principles and parameters. And here you have an example. So you could well say, I think, that particularly after SDG 7 and also obviously the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, there is now a need to reconcile and to recognize the urgency of the move towards new energy, so clean energy, that comes from these normative sources, and to recognize that in WTO law. So I would just simply throw this out here, so to speak, that the new climate regime that's anchored ultimately in SDG 7 and 13 places a demand for a reinterpretation of the received doctrines of national treatment and others under the WTO law that would rule out any kind of local content requirement, simply because of the urgency of the situation and the need for governments to act at this point to harvest the potential of particularly offshore wind energy. Yeah, and I think I will leave it at this, and just looking forward to any kind of comment. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. I can see we have questions from the audience, but do we have any questions to the last speaker? Just let me.
I think if the other colleagues here do not have anything to comment on Professor Roeben's words, we can go to the audience and the questions we have already there. And more questions can flock inside. So we are welcome once again. Now it's your time to pose your questions to the speakers.
Okay.
So Professor Malinauskaite, maybe you can read the question for everybody to hear also for the video purposes. And then the professors who can already read the question, of course, also in the Q&A section, can also respond. So the question is for Professor Gavouneli, and maybe, yes,
actually.
and there's also a hand also. So Professor Malinauskaite, maybe we can address also the question. We can read it also for the purpose of the video and everybody to be aware of the question.
Can the audience unmute? We have from Konstantina. I just wonder if she can, because
we can read in short
expansive.
also. The question has to do, and Professor Gavouneli can also, the other participants can read the question. The question has to do with the submarine cables. Do you believe that the tool of pipelines is starting to give its way to submarine cables? For instance, in the Mediterranean Sea, being characterized by great depths, floating technology seems to be a better fit. This is the first question by Konstantina Meletiadou. She has a second question that is also relevant. Could the solution of investing in electric interconnection through submarine cables is less expensive and more bearable perspective than investing in pipelines? Also, in times where climate litigation against both companies and states is flourishing, could cables be regarded as a less harmful way for energy transmission? These are the questions for Professor Gavouneli, maybe, but also the other participants can address them if they want.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Konstantina, for this. It's a question, of course, of money, and it's also a question of technology. We were not talking about cables at the time when we were not talking about electricity transmission, but we were actually talking about oil and gas. So the idea of having a pipeline, which is a major investment, a very complicated process. Again, the jurisdictional issues are simply huge. That was the only way possible in order to proceed. Nowadays, that we can actually move from the raw material, if you like, which is oil and gas, and we can move on directly to electricity. Electricity could be produced by oil and gas, could be produced by renewable sources of energy. Electricity is not a source, it's also a product. So now that we can have electricity produced by diverse sources, we can move that electricity all over the place, including through underwater cables. Do not assume for a moment that a cable is a cheap proposition. Okay? It's equally difficult with its own particularities. What is of essence, and I think it was Volker that referred to that earlier, by actually referring to old rules that need to be adjusted. If you are really talking about old rules, then we should talk about cables, because these go back to 1874, the first cable transmission between Paris and New York. And the provisions of that bilateral agreement between the US and France were actually taken almost copy-paste into the Law of the Sea Convention in 1982. So here we're talking about really ancient provisions in terms of technology that have been moved tel quel into a new system without major adjustments. So again, that is clearly a question that needs to be done. But if a black or white and white kind of response is needed, yes, then there is certainly easier to do that. Perhaps I could just raise one more point referring to what Raphael Heffron was talking about earlier about climate justice. Climate change litigation is using also human rights law, for instance, or domestic arrangements under administrative law to try and generate that change, not from above, but from below, from a sort of grassroots kind of approach. And I think the best example that I can think of is a recent case that is finding its way through to the European Court of Human Rights, but has started by Greenpeace Norway and gone through the system, simply because Greenpeace Norway was objecting to any new permits being given for oil and gas exploration and exploitation by the Norwegian government. And I was extremely amused, I must say, highly amused, when in the response of the state to the European Court of Human Rights, the government lawyers of Norway just said, 2 days after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, you see how right we were when we said that we need to go ahead because it's a question of security more than anything else. We have cases like that. Greenpeace Greece is also suing the government before the Conseil d'État, the administrative court, again for permits. It's highly unlikely that these would come through, but there are a number of cases that are finding their way before international courts and tribunals, and it will be very, very interesting, and international committees as well, treaty bodies, and it will be very interesting to see what type of impact they might have at the end of the day, and how they're going to spread this idea of climate justice through a system that operates with different tools. Thank you. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you. Solon, is it possible? I don't know if Konstantina
Yes, there is
something maybe, because it's...
Yes, there is also another question by Dr. Conway that we want to pose to the panel. First of all, does any other member of the panel want to add anything to Professor Gavouneli's words regarding the two first questions? From the silence, I understand no. So we can proceed to a general panel question posed by Dr. Conway from Brunel University London. And the question is, what extent does Brexit provide the UK a more flexible framework, or does it entail certain disadvantages to respond to climate change possibilities, for example, under the Paris Agreement? So the question is about Brexit, the UK, and the flexible framework or not. And it's to all the panel, so you're welcome to take the lead and respond. Professor Roeben, I see you're unmuted. Maybe you want to take the lead now. It also be in Durham.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, I think the answer to this is complex. I think there is probably no single answer to this. I think the big problem with Brexit is that there is an economic impact on the country that just makes it has as a consequence that there are fewer resources to spend on anything, including climate change. I think the other issue is how to mitigate some of the implications, including on the interconnectors with the continent. Now, that's a really interesting, a very important, critical infrastructure, and it operates under rules that were agreed by the European Union. And the UK relies very much on these interconnectors. The previous ill-fated premiership of Ms. Truss tried to solve some of this and to approach these, to make the rules work again in a bilateral manner. So pragmatically approaching this. I think that's something that's very promising, and certainly it's urgently needed. Interestingly enough, there's also a very important aspect of cooperation in the Northern Seas. The riparian countries of the North Sea, that's Denmark, Netherlands, and so forth, have actually been working on solving some of these very intricate questions of setting up a truly multinational framework of pipeline cables, really, and the high voltage direct current cables that can transport the offshore energy to land. They are very difficult issues, but they have made some progress on this. But the membership was restricted to EU members, and there may be a chance for the UK to rejoin this. It was very active before, and it may hopefully rejoin this effort later. Yeah, and otherwise, I think the UK has been very innovative. Some of these economically efficient subsidization. I call it subsidization. It's effectively what it is. Government support mechanisms, including the contracts for differences, that have been copied all over the place on the continent, and we would hope that that the UK, but it was never, the EU law always allowed this. It had a very general directives that said, you can have these things, and please come up with something that is efficient. And the UK had been a thought leader on this, and it stands to hope that will continue, and then others will hopefully profit from this leadership. But as I said, it's the same. The WTO issue is something that is relevant for both the UK and the EU, even after Brexit. That's not going to go away. Thank you.
Maybe if Professor Heffron, Professor Gavouneli, you want to comment on that question?
Thank you. Do they have any other panel members that would like to comment?
Yeah, I'll just say that in the short term, Brexit should be seen as a positive. It gives the UK more freedom to develop innovative loan policy. In the longer term, it may be seen as a negative, as there is no real maybe driver of change. The UK could be left behind because you're losing that competitive dynamic over time with the European energy sector. And what you would need is for, leadership to be taking actions, and as we have seen, the UK leadership in politics is some way off maybe where it should be in terms of this whole energy and climate debate, and not to mention the short reign of Liz Truss, but also the U-turn by the current Prime Minister, and let's say arguably his previous performance as Chancellor didn't maybe augment well for maybe ambitious and leading policy initiatives. But so for me, there are many exciting initiatives in the works that have been in the works for many years in the UK, but I wonder where the next generation of those innovative policy ideas will come from, given that maybe the UK doesn't need to respond to different actions by European neighboring countries.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Professor Malinauskaite, maybe we can wrap up the event, if that's okay. Also, speakers.
Yeah, I can see some participants leaving now. I would like to, first of all, thank all panel members for your fantastic presentations and for raising really, important issues. And obviously these debates will continue because we still have so many challenges to overcome. But it seems that we all are in agreement that the investment in renewable energy, it's a key to go. Unfortunately, we're still behind with climate. What will happen in the years to come? Thank you. Obviously, energy justice. We want that clean. Raphael, I really like your idea that we need to think not about north but south as well to achieve this. Thank you, organizers as well, Solon and Patricia, and as well audience for your questions. Thank you for attending this.
Indeed, we thank everybody, and we look forward to welcoming everybody to the next also BUL International Law event, which is going to take place in November. Wishing everybody a nice evening, and thank you for being with us tonight. Good night.
Thank you so very much for the invitation.
Thank you.